We bid you a good afternoon once again from the Working Class Movement Library, and we welcome particularly Pete Strong, who has, at very short notice, very kindly volunteered to talk to us on this Armistice Day about somebody who is very much connected with World War One. So over to you. Thank you, Pete.
Right. Hi, Lynette and everybody. Thanks for coming along. Nice to recognise one or two people. Nick Mansfield, I can see there, who I remember coming giving a talk to us in Cardiff. But I'm just going to share my screen now so I can put the PowerPoint up. There it is. Right. Haven't been in. Oh, I've one too far, so just bear with me a moment. There we are. Okay. Right. So, as you see, my talk today is working class hero Ted Gill of Abertillery. Now, for those who don't know, Abertillery is a mining, or was a mining town, about 15 miles north of Newport on the South Wales coalfield. And we're going to start our story really at the end with this this grave. I must have visited it about 10 years ago now. As you see, it's quite undistinguished, untended, largely forgotten, but it marks the life of a man well worth remembering. The life of a socialist who remained true to his principles under very, very trying circumstances, and might well have become a household name and something of a national hero had his life not been cut cruelly short. So let's go back actually then to the beginning of the story of Edward Gill, or Ted Gill, as he was almost universally known. So he was born here in at 29 South Street, Leominster, in Herefordshire, in what is now a car park, bordered. In fact, the car park, perhaps appropriately enough, belongs to the Royal British Legion. Now, his parents were both Welsh. His father was from Montgomeryshire, and he's listed on the census as a railway timber agent. But according to family tradition, he owned a pub in Leominster, but he drank the profits. As a result, the family were in considerable financial difficulties. Now, Ted himself went to this school, which is still functioning. This is Leominster National School, but he left at the age of 10. He found work as a newspaper delivery boy, and this is believed to be a photograph of him, which I was given by his great nephew, Mike Everly. For many thanks for that. But about this time, they moved from Leominster to Somerset Street in Abertillery. Now, Abertillery was very much a rapidly growing town at the time, the most important town on what we call the Western Valley of Gwent, on the South Wales coalfield there. Had a big influx of people, for example, from the rural counties of England looking for work in the mines. So this would have been, about the turn of the century. Now, Ted started work at this colliery, Pennybon Colliery, in Abertillery at the age of 15, before then moving on to another nearby one, Gray's colliery. He was also quite a sportsman. He played rugby for Abertillery, and he also competed in the Welsh cross-country championships. But he was very keen to educate himself and went to technical classes in the evening. He married quite young in 1902 at the age of 23 to Annie Hutchings, who lived in a nearby street and apparently was from a family that was involved in the movement. And they had a son the following year. But the next year, tragically, Annie died of cancer at the age of only 21. Now, Ted increasingly devoted himself to the local labour movement. Abertillery was very much a socialist town. The ILP and the Labour Representation Committee dominated local politics. There were very strong trade unions, particularly, of course, what in South Wales was known as the Fed, the South Wales Miners Federation, the Miners Union. And they were involved in a constant battle, of course, with the coal owners in what one historian has called the cockpit of a class war in South Wales. Now, it was through the Fed that Ted found an outlet for his talents. He was naturally quite a shy and retiring sort of guy, but he was highly intelligent, very articulate, and he seemed to have those sort of natural leadership skills. He very soon came to represent Grey Lodge on the Western Valleys Miners' Council, which was basically the Abertillery district of the South Wales Miners' Federation. And he must have impressed them because in 1907, they awarded him a scholarship to go to Ruskin College in Oxford. And we see him here looking very dapper at Ruskin. Now, for those who don't know, Ruskin College was established in 1899 specifically to educate working class adults. And its students were nearly always sponsored by their local trade unions. And the idea was that they could then return to serve their local labour movements, for example, in trade union negotiations, as local councillors and so on, so that they would be in a position to compete with the so-called better educated representatives of the ruling class. Now, although Ruskin was situated in Oxford, it was not part of the university, and for example, there were no exams there. And Ruskin had an important impact on Ted, both politically and personally. Personally, it was there that he met Mabel Whitfield, according to family tradition, meeting in a bookshop. They were soon married and had a son. Politically, it very much strengthened his already strong socialist convictions, helped by this sort of atmosphere in Oxford, which was somewhat febrile. There was no love lost really between Ruskin students and the university undergraduates, who were of course mainly the sons of the ruling class. There were frequent conflicts. One famous one was after a meeting at Ruskin, which had been addressed by Keir Hardie. The university students attacked Ruskin and smashed the windows, while the Ruskin students were up on the upper floors, pouring boiling water down upon them in some sort of medieval siege scene. Now, Ted took the debate, though, to the university students. He spoke at the Oxford Union, and again, there's a story, but he only had one suit, and he put it on to go to the meeting, and then promptly managed to spill a paraffin lamp over himself. So actually addressed the Oxford Union, smelling strongly of paraffin. Now, a bit ironically, moving away from South Wales also brought Ted into closer contact with some of the other young militant miners from other parts of South Wales, in particular Noah Ablett from Porth in the Rhondda Valley, a very well-known figure in Welsh Labour history. Now, both were becoming increasingly, I suppose, Marxist in their outlook. Now, between them, Ted and Noah Ablett led resistance to the changes that were being introduced by the Ruskin governors. They were trying to draw the college closer to the university, and for example, they introduced exams, which the students promptly boycotted. Now, in this, Ted and Noah had the in the protests. Ted and Noah had the tacit support of the Ruskin principal, Dennis Hurd. That's H-I-R-D. You'll see the significance of the spelling later. What the students wanted was a specifically socialist education to equip them for what they saw as the class war. This led Ted, Noah Ablett, and others to set up the Plebs League with branches up and down the country, and they ran classes in political education. They had their own newspaper, and I know that up in the working class library there, you've got copies of the Pleb newspaper that you very kindly allowed me to look at when I came up a couple of years back, and it was highly influential in educating young trade unionists and socialists. Now, after successfully completing his 2 years at Ruskin, Ted returned to Abertillery in 1909. A few weeks after that, a student strike began at Ruskin after the principal, Dennis Hurd, had been forced to resign. Ted and Noah Ablett campaigned in South Wales for trade unions to support the strikers. And of the two, Ted was the most successful. He gained support from the Western Valleys Miners' Council for the establishment of the breakaway Central Labour College, which was initially in Oxford, but then later moving to London as a radical socialist alternative to Ruskin. And it was largely financed by the Western Valleys Miners' Council and by the Abertillery branch of the National Union of Railwaymen. Now, Ted served on the management committee of the Central Labour College from 1909 until the outbreak of the First World War. He also visited all the South Wales branches of the Plebs League as a speaker and a tutor. This brought him into contact with, amongst others, a young man from Tredegar by the name of Aneurin Bevan. You might have heard of him. And he later became a student at the Central Labour College. Now, young militants like Ted were very much the rising stars of the trade union movement in South Wales. Ted was elected to the executive of the South Wales Miners' Federation, and by 1913 was a full-time union negotiator and also a town councillor. But he was still a highly skilled, technically qualified miner. So when in 1913 there was an explosion at the Sengenneth colliery that you see here in Glamorgan that killed 439 miners, Ted was one of the early rescue team that went down to try to get them out. Now, along with other young radicals, Ted had very clear ideas on international affairs. He saw the rising tension in Europe as being due to capitalism and the greed for colonies and markets. If war broke out, it would be a capitalist war. And when indeed war did break out, Ted told the Western Valleys Miners' Council, "I know what this war is about, and I want no part of it." On the very first day of war, as that sort of patriotic tide was sweeping through the country, Ted stood out against it. And he wrote a letter on that day to his local newspaper, the South Wales Gazette. And he said, "Unless strenuous efforts are made to organise anti-war feeling, we are on the eve of a Holocaust too terrible for contemplation. The enemy is within the gates of Europe, not without it. It fattens upon war and preparations for war, and can only be overthrown by organised social democracy. Let us then, as workers, cultivate a proper perspective concerning the awful meaning of the whole thing. Already, above the marching of men, the beating of drums, and the songs of pseudo-patriotism can be heard the wail of the husbandless and fatherless, the cry of the multitude for bread. Prices rise above the purse of the proletariat, accompanied by a displacement of labour, unbalanced by the fact that the flower of the artisan population have proved the target of shot and shell." Powerful words, not bad for a guy who left school at the age of 10. But he was soon changing his mind. The German invasion of Belgium and the atrocities that were accompanied by that meant that indeed the majority of trade unionists began to support the war. In October, 2 months into the war, he wrote another letter. "I must confess that events have forced me to conclusions that are very unpalatable. I ask myself what stands between the homes of the people of this country now we're at war and an application of the devilish doctrine of force displayed in Belgium and France. I confess that the only bulwark I see for the moment consists of that multitude of men of all classes in the fighting ranks on land and sea." But in the same letter, he stressed that he was still very much a socialist, calling for better payments for soldiers' families, supporting the ILP pound a week campaign for soldiers' families to get a pound a week allowance, and also calling for a super tax on the rich. In January 1915, he followed perhaps the logic of his own convictions and enlisted into the South Wales, the 10th Battalion, the South Wales Borderers, known as the 1st Gwents. They were a POWs battalion, part of what is called the 38th Division of the British Army, but also known as the New Welsh Army. He appealed for other socialists to enlist, comparing German militarism with British liberalism. He pointed out, for example, how Britain had been always, at that time, a sanctuary to refugees of all lands, citing, for example, Giuseppe Mazzini and Karl Marx as examples. Perhaps a prescient point there. The army, perhaps unusually, showed a rare outbreak of intelligence and immediately recognized that they had an influential figure on their hands. And very unusually for a working class volunteer, commissioned Ted as a second lieutenant. And then promptly sent him back to Abertillery to work as a recruiting officer. Now, while he was recruiting in Abertillery, tragedy again hit the family because Ted's brother, John, was killed at Ypres in early 1915. By the autumn of 1915, conscription was looking likely. Many trade unions, including the Abertillery miners, were very hostile to the idea of conscription. So tension was very much in the air when, in October 15, Ted addressed a mass recruiting meeting at Abertillery Drill Hall, which is still there. The South Wales Gazette reported a strong contingent of the local Independent Labour Party came into the drill hall just before the speeches commenced, and those present expected a demonstration of some kind. Now, Ted adopted an openly political approach. He argued that volunteers were needed if conscription was to be avoided. He contrasted the free institutions of Britain with the militaristic society of Germany, stating that German workers were shackled by the Kaiser's government, and added that he was still very much a Labour man. Now, whether it was Ted's speech or what, but the demonstration never materialized or remained quiet. Now, after this, Ted was transferred to a combat role, sent on a machine gun course at Hayling Island down on the south coast. Then rejoined his battalion at the 1st Gwent near Winchester for final training before they went to France. Training that was incidentally severely hampered by the lack of rifles. The men were sharing rifles at that stage. On the 3rd of December 1915, they sailed over to France, taking their place in the line at Festubert in February of 1916. Festubert is about 15 miles southwest of Lille. It's very much low-lying, waterlogged country. So instead of having the trenches that you normally associate with the front line, you couldn't have those because they would just immediately fill with water. They actually built up from the ground what they call breastworks, and then there were sort of in no man's land, really sort of islands of reasonably dry ground that they tried to occupy. There were no communication trenches that allowed you to move from the sort of behind the line into the front because they would just fill with water. So movement was only possible at night. It was a pretty nasty place to be. Now, by this time, conscription was in force. It's early 1916. Ted's position at the front was being used by the local press against conscientious objectors. This is an editorial from the South Wales Gazette. The young conscripts with hypersensitive consciences who appeared before the Abertillery Tribunal to support their appeals against their liability to rub shoulders with better men. Many an honest foot, we know, itched to kick them down the stairs of the council offices. To one who objected as a socialist, Tribune W.H. Lloyd administered a notable rebuke. I will tell you, my friend, as a socialist, he was a Labour councillor, he said, but I don't think there is any credit in him as a socialist making this application. Well said, thou sturdy comrade of Edward Gill, and the true-hearted socialists who fight with him in Flanders. I don't think Ted would have been very pleased to have been used in that way, as we might see later. Now, back in Festubert, the early hours of February 26, 1916, still dark, snow was on the ground. One of Ted's men had crawled back from a machine gun post in one of the islands in no man's land, wounded in the neck. He reported that the post was under attack. Ted crawled out under heavy fire and led his men from the machine gun post to safety, but then discovered that a corporal was still out in no man's land. So he crawled out under fire again, found the man lying in the snow, and carried him back to safety. For this, Ted was awarded the Military Cross. In fact, he was the first coal miner ever to be awarded the Military Cross. Now, that's perhaps not quite as unusual or strange as you might expect, because the Military Cross was only ever awarded to officers. Other ranks got the military medal. And of course, particularly at this stage of the war, very few coal miners were officers. He received the Military Cross, having been sent on leave, receiving that at Buckingham Palace from the King. And then the next day came down to Abertillery, arriving at Abertillery station, and was met by cheering crowds, where he was driven through the streets by led by contingents from the Boys Brigade, the police, local councillors, and other notables. When they got to the Tabernacle Chapel in the town, there were speeches, and a special verse was read out. Now, I must warn you, this is not Wilfred Owen. This is terrible poetry, but it does perhaps sum up the local feeling. With pleasure I join the multitude here to honour a hero and express our revere. We are proud of his gallantry, hero a brave, who risked his own life for the life he could save. The King has adorned him for what he has done. Abertillery is doting on what he has won. Oh, that's a terrible line. He's got it in him full of British grit, hero in the battlefield, hero in the pit. You will join me now, I am certain you will, in the cheers for a gallant Lieutenant E. Gill. So that was part of the celebration. He was also awarded a certificate from the Abertillery Penny Fund, which was a campaign that Ted had supported financially to provide financial assistance to people who were suffering financially as a result of the war. Now, here he is again. In his own speech, he did condemn the brutality of the Germans, but stressed that he was still a collier, and after the war, he would still be a trade unionist. He said that somebody had said that he was against war before the war, but stressed he was more against war now than ever. He took the opportunity while in Abertillery to restore his trade union links by attending a meeting of the Western Valleys Miners' Council, which, although had a lot of anti-war people on it, they actually congratulated Ted on his award of the Military Cross. Now, by July 1916, he was back in France with his battalion. And of course, July 1916 means the Battle of the Somme. Ted's men joined the battle in its second week, taking part in what in this neck of the woods is the infamous 38th Welsh Division attack on Mametz Wood. Mametz Wood being the largest wood on the Somme battlefield. Now, the initial attack took place on the 7th of July, but a preliminary bombardment had been totally ineffective. The Germans were so well established inside the wood. There had been a smoke screen promised, but that failed to materialize. So the men found themselves attacking across a ploughed field in heavy rain. There was heavy fire from the wood in front of them and from the copse to the right that you can see in the picture there behind the Welsh Memorial. Far from achieving the capture of the wood, they never even reached it. And so tried again 2 or 3 days later. The 2nd Gwents, the sister battalion in the first wave, managed to enter the wood in the morning, and bitter hand-to-hand fighting started. In the early afternoon, the 1st Gwent, Ted's battalion, was sent in. It took another day's fighting involving most of the 38th Division to clear the wood. But it was achieved at very heavy cost, 4,000 dead or wounded, including 180 from Ted's battalion. Now, those wounded included Ted himself. Now, Ted had been leading a detachment of 8 Lewis guns along with 20 men when he was hit by shrapnel, which left him semi-conscious. He was brought up onto a stretcher, but propped himself up and tried to shout instructions to his men when he was hit by a bullet. And the story goes that because he had his mouth open shouting instructions, the bullet went in one cheek, through his mouth and out the other. Had his mouth been shut, it would have shattered his teeth, then had gone through his brain, and he would have almost certainly been killed. But his troubles weren't over there. As he was being carried back on the stretcher, a shell exploded close by, which half buried him and the whole of the stretcher bearer team. They were left out in no man's land until darkness and almost died of exposure before getting back to safety. Ted was taken to a military hospital in France and then shipped back across the channel to the Royal Free Hospital in London. He was in a very bad state, weakened by the journey. He was due an operation, but that operation had to be postponed because the surgeons were in a state of exhaustion. I mean, over something like 10,000 men a day were coming across from France at that time into the hospitals in Britain. He eventually had his operation, was in hospital for 2 months, occasionally in very weak condition when there were fears for his life, but he did pull through and was then sent on extended sick leave. But that was the end of Ted's war. After a long, slow recovery, he was discharged from the army with the rank of captain. Following his discharge, he was offered a post with the coal controller, helping to run the coal industry, which in effect had been nationalised for the duration of the war. He turned this down, though, and returned to Abertillery to resume his labour movement activities. In July 1918, while the war was still on, he was selected as Labour candidate for the constituency of Frome in Somerset. Now, Frome was and is a sort of a quiet market town, not exactly natural Labour stronghold, but the constituency actually covered a huge area. It stretched right up to the outskirts of Bristol and also included the North Somerset coalfield with towns like Radstock and Poulton. The election was actually called by Lloyd George on the 14th of November, 3 days after the armistice, to take place on the 14th of December. Labour had been in a coalition, of course, in Lloyd George's government, but they now left the coalition to stand independently in what was known as the coupon election. This meant that in each constituency, one candidate would be given a letter of approval from Lloyd George. They were almost all either Lloyd George Liberals or Conservatives. Now, in spite of the election being called, Ted actually spent the first weekend after the war still in Abertillery, where he delivered 2 lectures to raise funds for the Disabled Soldiers and Sailors Association. The first was on the influence of literature on life. And I think it says something not just about Ted having become something of an intellectual, but also about the spirit of the age and of the community, that in an overwhelmingly working class town like Abertillery, large numbers would turn up and pay to listen to a lecture on this sort of topic. His second lecture was called Tommy and Reconstruction. And in this, he dealt with the great social problems like slums, disease, poverty, and so on, and warned that if they thought the men who had fought and bled for this country were coming back to these conditions, they were in for a rude awakening. And as always, he was anxious to stress his commitment to socialism. In case anybody went away from this meeting and said to a friend, Ted Gill didn't say anything about socialism, Now he has been a captain in the army, he is no socialist, he wanted to say, but Ted Gill had not changed his opinions, neither had he abandoned his principles. The system they had now did not grow in a day or a night, and it was not going to go in a day or a night. They could have revolution without barricades. They could bring about reforms by peaceful progress. Now, that speech, while reaffirming its commitment to socialism, also, of course, shows that he had moved away from his earlier, more or less revolutionary position. And this was also reflected in many of his speeches that he made in Frome in the run-up to the election. But he also very much opposed what he called the persecution of conscientious objectors, many of whom were personally known to him, having been old comrades of his. In the election in Frome, there were three other candidates. Just briefly on them, the first one, Sir John Barlow, was the sitting MP, had been for 25 years. He was an Asquith Liberal. When the Liberal Party split during the war, and Lloyd George's lot went one way, Asquith's went the other. Now, Barlow was deeply unpopular in Frome. He only ever came to Frome once a year, and even the reactionary local newspaper, but Somerset Standard, said he was a man who had contempt for the people. The next candidate was Colonel Kincaid Smith. He belonged to the extreme right-wing Nationalist Party, founded by Horatio Bottomley, the founder of John Bull magazine. He was a sort of Nigel Farage of his day, so less said about him, the better. Then there was this guy, Percy Hurd, H-U-R-D this time. He was the Conservative candidate, and also the official coalition candidate. He was the man with Lloyd George's coupon. You might recognise that name, Hurd, especially if you're of a more mature generation, because Percy Hurd was in fact the grandfather of Douglas Hurd, who was Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary under Maggie Thatcher. And far be it from me to elicit sympathy for a Tory, but Percy actually had lost two sons killed in the war. Now, the local paper, the Somerset Standard, was openly pro-conservative and hostile to Labour. It wrote that the tyranny of the Labour Party is likely to prove far greater and more selfish than any exercise by monarchy, autocracy, or plutocracy in the past. And in relation to Ted, the Standard adopted the approach of separate the man from the party. And it too turned to verse. And this is just as bad as the previous ones. Well, first of all, there's Captain Gill, a gallant man from Wales. He's done his bit all right, but I'm thinking of his pals. For Labour's underneath the thumb of Ramsay Mac and Smillie, who seem to think that now's the chance, if once they get their men in, to introduce that Russian dance they've learnt from Trotsky Lenin. I'm not sure if the Somerset Standard knew that Trotsky and Lenin were two separate people or not. Ramsay Mac and Smillie, of course, Ramsay MacDonald, one of the Labour Party leaders, and Robert Smillie, the militant president of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, both of whom, of course, had very much opposed the war. Now, the election result was as follows. Sir John Barlow, Liberal, 2,002. Captain Gill, Labour, 10,454. Colonel Kincaid Smith, Nationalist, 258. Percy Hurd, Conservative, 11,118. Ted had failed to win the seat by 664 votes, but he noted that only a third of the serving soldiers on the electoral roll for that constituency had cast their votes. Those votes might have made a huge difference. Now, following the election, he became national organiser for the Labour Memorial for Freedom and Peace Fund. Now, this had arisen from a Labour Party decision made in 1918 to erect a large hall and hotel in London as a memorial to the trade unionists who had fought and died in the war. It was planned that it would provide a headquarters for the Labour Party and also facilities for other labour movement organisations. However, although considerable funds were raised, the onset of an economic slump in the 1920s meant that the scheme was eventually abandoned. This is why, for many years, of course, Labour headquarters was not in a building of its own, but in Transport House in London, rented from the Transport and General Workers Union. A golden opportunity to become a Member of Parliament presented itself to Ted in 1920 when a by-election was fought in Abertillery. He was asked to stand, but stuck by an earlier promise to not to compete with his friend George Whittaker, who you see seated with Ted here. George was therefore selected and consequently elected as MP for Abertillery. By this time, Ted had become a full-time special propagandist for the Labour Party. His skill as an orator was much in demand, and he travelled up and down the country from Cornwall to Northumberland, making speeches in support of the Labour cause. He returned to Frome to fight the seat in the general election in November 1922, which came about because the Conservatives had decided to ditch the coalition. This time, it was a straight fight between him and Percy Hurd. Once again, he had to cope with the virulent anti-Labour line adopted by the Somerset Standard. We have not a word to say against Captain Gill on personal grounds. Unlike most of his party, he puts a restraint upon the wording of his public utterances. His speeches are so designed as to conceal the danger of the policy for which he stands. It is therefore incumbent on us to emphasize with all our power the policy of which Captain Gill is the official exponent. It is the greatest power, the greatest peril that has ever confronted this country. It is a policy that can have been conceived only in Bedlam. In a word, it is the red flag and all that it connotes. It means revolution. If the Labour Party are given the opportunity of carrying out their mad proposals, then this country will be in a condition of stagnation and starvation that Russia now finds itself. Gosh, it makes the Daily Express sound almost moderate. The Standard denounced Ted's call, for example, for a tax on capital as disastrous, and for a national minimum wage for farm workers as pathetic, even though the government actually was to introduce such a policy the following year. In spite of this, Ted still had high hopes that the votes of the Somerset miners would see him through. His central committee rooms were set up not in Frome, but in the mining town of Radstock. Percy Hurd was widely heckled when he spoke in the pit villages. Yet once again, it was not to be. Although the Labour vote increased from 10,000 odd to over 14,000, Percy polled just over 15,000 with a majority of 706. In his speech to supporters in Radstock after the result had been announced, Ted put his defeat down largely to his failure to win the support of the farm workers, and he railed against the farmers, that's the owners of the farms, the bosses, who had put their cars at the disposal of the rural workers to vote him down. In July 1923, Ted was in Blythe in Northumberland, supporting Robert Smillie, the Labour candidate in the Morpeth by-election. They were old acquaintances, having met during their trade union work in the Miners' Federation. They had taken different paths during the war, as we said, with Robert Smillie maintaining his opposition to the war. But clearly Ted was well prepared to put such differences behind him in the interests of Labour unity. Now, during the election campaign, in fact, I think on eve of poll, Ted was taken seriously ill. He was admitted to hospital in Blythe, but weakened by his war wounds and overwork, he gradually went downhill, and he died a few days later on 29th of June, 1923. He was 42 years old. Now, had he lived a few months more, he might well have become a Member of Parliament. since in the general election of December 1923, same year, Labour captured the Frome constituency. And of course, as a result of that general election in the following year, the first ever Labour government was formed. There is no doubt that Ted's work in 1918 and 1922 had done much to pave the way for the victory in Frome, and indeed helped with the subsequent formation of the Labour government. Now, Ted was buried in New Cemetery, Abertillery. As his body was brought down by road from Northumberland, it passed through several different mining areas, and thousands of miners and their families lined the route with caps off and heads bowed. The funeral procession in Abertillery was literally a mile long. Mourners included several members of Parliament and people such as Frank Hodges, the Secretary of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain. The Great War had done much to divide society and the labour movement. Yet Ted had bridged the chasm. I think it's fair to say. Whether we agree or disagree with his views, it is clear that Ted had heroically served his country and his cause, remaining unswervingly loyal to both. Although the wounds he suffered in the war were largely responsible for his early death, and he is commemorated amongst the names of the fallen, as you see here on Abertillery War Memorial, he did not qualify for a war grave. He therefore lies largely forgotten in that civilian grave that we saw at the beginning, with nobody to tend it. It's perhaps ironic that in searching for his grave in that cemetery, the way I came across it was finding another war grave with the name E.J. Gill, which is next door to it because it's the grave of his nephew, who died in 1943 during the Second World War. So that's Ted's story. I think the point of it was, well, partly to celebrate the life of I think a significant person, but also to demonstrate the divided nature of the labour movement at the time, with good socialists on both sides, but also that unity could indeed be achieved after such division. So with that message, I'll just say thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And we are seeing people applauding you virtually. Very interesting indeed. Yes, following on from last week's talk about conscientious objectors, it's very interesting to hear of a different case. And I was very struck by the phrase, the awful meaning of the whole thing on this day of Armistice Day. So thank you very much indeed, Peter. I will jump to a gallery view now so I can see if anybody wants to ask anything or make a comment. I am seeing lots of very thoughtful faces, but nobody who is waving at me.
Oh, somebody is. Phil?
Oh, are they? Where's that?
No, maybe not. No.
I'm going to, because we were at 32 people, so I'm jumping between screens there. But yes, I think people are being contemplative today now.
Gordon?
Oh, hang on, there is Gordon. Gordon, I can see you are waving. There you go. Do you want to say something?
Unmute yourself.
Yes, you need to unmute yourself, Gordon. Can you?
Unmute my audio.
There you go. You're on now. Yep.
Yeah, it was interesting because also a fellow Ruskin student. So.
Oh, right.
Interesting. Yeah, no brand new Ablet, though I haven't particularly read or forgotten about his involvement. Oh, interesting you say because there was animosity after, but I mean that was healed. What was his attitude to Russia and the Hands Off Russia campaign?
I don't have any specific information, but I would think almost certainly he supported the Hands Off Russia campaign. Ted was very much still in line with the left of the Labour Party, the Independent Labour Party, and would have had no truck with sending the troops to Russia.
I muted you again. Sorry, Gordon, because I heard something about it. Sorry. Do you want to unmute yourself again? Do you want to unmute yourself, Gordon? Or we're done? No? Okay, we're done. Oh, yeah, go on. Yep.
Know what happened to his children?
I don't know what happened to the child from the first marriage. The second child, John, actually grew up to be an actor. He did a little bit of minor television. I think he was in, was it Murder, She Wrote with, what's her name, Lansbury? Not George Lansbury, but
Angela.
So Angela Lansbury, that's the one, who I think was related to George Lansbury, actually, but that's another story. Yeah, and when I started researching Ted, he was John was still alive. I never got to meet him though. He was over 90 at the time. I did meet Ted's what would it be? His niece, I think, who still lived in Abertillery. She again was very old and was in supported accommodation, but was a real character. And when I went to talk to her, she was actually plotting her escape. I quite expected sand to fall out the bottom of her trousers, like some sort of prisoner of war, a war film. Yeah, and the family have gone far and wide. One of his, I think, grandchildren has a very high position in universities in Australia. Another one who I did meet is a consultant geriatric psychiatrist in Canada, and I met him when he came across on a visit a few years back. So the family was quite special, and it just highlights how so many of the youngsters of Ted's generation leaving school at 10, they were robbed of the education that they should have had. In some cases, they managed to do what Ted did. In other cases, as I say, they're just robbed.
Thank you. Ken Whittaker asks, do you think Ted was duped by pro-war propaganda?
No, I think it's more complex than that. I think one of the things is people like Ted weren't idiots. They were politically very sophisticated. Yeah, the whole thing about Belgian atrocities, of course, they were exaggerated, and even in reports after the war, they were exaggerated. But there was a great deal of very real atrocity going on, and I think there was a genuine feeling that it was a genuine war against German aggression. A lot of people, of course, as time went on, began to feel differently. There were a lot of people who were prepared to support the war as a war of defense, but by 1916, for example, were pushing hard for a negotiated peace, a peace based on, for example, no indemnities, no annexations. So I think it would be too simple to say that Ted was fooled by wartime propaganda.
Okay, thank you very much. I've also spotted Nick Mansfield, and knowing that he's written about a book about soldiers, and I don't know if you've anything you want to contribute, Nick. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
yes, thank you very much, Peter. That was brilliant, and it's nice to have a great example of a Labour patriot. But of course, there were hundreds, thousands of them, and if you're interested. David Swift's done this book called For Class and Country, which illustrates a lot of them. I think it's very simplistic to take that view, Lynette. Sorry to be, jump down your throat. And even when you're studying the ILP, one shouldn't equate ILP with conscientious objectors. I mean, long ago, David Howe did some stats on this and found, I can't remember what it was Bradford branch, and there were 3 times as many volunteers as there were COs. And, there were lots of them. And sometimes in very very dangerous positions. The classic example is Edward Mannock, who became the greatest air ace on the Western Front. He won the VC and all sorts. Yeah, he was secretary of the ILP branch in Northamptonshire. I've forgotten the name of the town now. So you know, apparently he would preach socialism in the officers' mess to all these flying corps people and so on. So it's a very complex situation. Peter, I'm interested in the National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Soldiers and Sailors, which you mentioned he'd done some work for. And of course that acted as a sort of left-wing British Legion for a couple of years after the war. Eventually that got bribed to be part of the British Legion when it amalgamated. Have you found anything more on his role there? Did he just lecture, or was he, was he a member? Do you know?
I wouldn't be at all surprised if he was a member. Of course, by this time, he was up and down the country, not in Abertillery very much, and so, you know, not in a position to be heavily involved in a single branch. There is a lot of newspaper material, more generally, on the discharged soldiers and sailors and the other ex-servicemen's organisations in the Newport and Abertillery area, and quite serious conflicts between them, very much in line with what you were indicating before. But I don't know about Ted's specific role in that.
Okay, thank you. Nick, someone's just said, who was the author again of that for Class and Country?
Yeah, David Swift.
David Swift. Okay, thank you.
It's Liverpool University Press 2017.
Yeah. The full title is For Class and Country: The Patriotic Left in the First World War. Is it Swift or Smith?
Swift.
It is Swift, is it? Yeah.
As in
and the bird.
Fast.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So a question from Sue. How much was he influenced by the women in his family? I'm thinking that many communities tend to have strong mothers because of the high death rates at work for the men. Yeah,
the Welsh Mam is again a legendary figure in our local history. Is very, very powerful women. There's no doubt that there were very powerful women in the Abertillery labour movement. There's no indication that Ted was brought up as a socialist, though. I think it was Abertillery that turned Ted into a socialist rather than his family. But as I said, he married. His initial marriage was into a labour movement family, and the fact that he met his second wife in a bookshop, it'd be difficult to draw certain conclusions from that, but I think it does say something. I'm told that Tory canvassers look through windows, and if they see books in the house, they don't bother to knock at the door nowadays. sorry if that's a bit...
That's a great anecdote. I'm going to use that one. Okay, do we have any more questions? Anyone want to wave at me, or any comments or just reflections on what we've heard? No, I think we. Oh, Maggie, are you waving at me, Maggie? Do you want to? You need to unmute yourself, Maggie. Can you press the button? Yes, you're on.
Okay. It's only just that my father was fought through the First World War, and he was made an officer in 1916 with all the deaths and so on.
Yeah.
And I've got the piece of paper that George V sort of in copperplate writing, etc. And it had a great big red temporary printed stamped right across it. And to make quite sure that once war had ended, people coming up from the other classes would be put back down again, and this was just an emergency situation. It's lovely. I really love that. So temporary.
So an officer, but not a gentleman.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Maggie. Okay, I think we may be drawing to a conclusion.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Before you
No,
disappear-
there's something you want to,
Yeah, I just want to plug
tell
an
people
event.
about. So yes,
Yeah.
please
There's
do.
something that might be of interest to you Zoomers from the Working Class Library. In Newport, the area, where I sort of come, where I live. Newport, of course, is famous for the Chartist Rising in 1839. 22 Chartists were killed by British troops after trying to storm the Westgate Hotel in the town. Every year, we hold a Newport Chartist convention, a day conference, usually at this time of year on the anniversary, November the 4th. But because of the COVID situation, we put it back to December, and we're holding it over Zoom. So we're going to have 3 separate lectures on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Well, in fact, they're going to go on our website and be broadcast at any time, followed by Q&A sessions on the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 4th, 5th, and 6th of December. So if you're interested in that, the details will very shortly go onto our website, which is www.newportrising, or one word, newportrising.co.uk. So if you're interested, you'll be very welcome indeed.
Newport, I'm going to try and stick it in, www.newportrising.co.uk.
That's it, you got it.
Okay, there you go. You should be able to click through to that, folks, if you want to then go and have a check. Great, yes, thank you. I've just had somebody this morning contact me saying, do we want a talk about Chartism? And I was starting to think about the new series for 2021. So yes, there's some Chartism on the way, I hope so. So yeah, thank you very much indeed. I particularly appreciate you putting yourself forward for what's a fascinating talk. So I'm so glad you were here last week and knew that we had a gap that's very, very appropriately filled, and yeah, we thank you terrifically, and good luck with the Newport Chartist talks as well. So folks, we do hope that a lot of you will join us again next week. Now, next week is actually on Thursday, just to fool you all. Thursday, the 19th of November is Being Human Festival Day, and it's also History Day. So at 2 o'clock that day, it is more appropriate than on the Wednesday for us to be focusing on our new podcasts. We have a lockdown project funded by the Arts Council, and we have some very exciting things to share with you. So we do hope that you will be able to join us. There's more information on our website, and there'll be more coming up. And at least one person who's involved in the project I can see here on the screen. So we are really excited to be launching that and sharing it with you. The Being Human Festival, Thursday, the 19th of November at 2 o'clock. You'll be able to catch up with it later because we'll record it as we've recorded this. If you joined in a bit late and you want to see it, I'll be uploading it shortly to www.youtube.com/WCM Library. And also just to that final plug again, that if you feel able to donate, there's a button on our website and we'd be delighted if you'd click on it. So thank you very much to our speaker particularly, but to all participants as well. And we will just close as usual by saying take care, in solidarity, with thanks from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.